Right. Wake up. The government has due to an emergency. Freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech are gone. Censorship is ruthlessly enforced. Questioning the government or its actions is forbidden. This government works with a US-led company to track everyone in the country. This was Germany in 1933, and you don't have to look hard to see the same thing happening today. History does not read, but it does rhyme. If we don't learn from history, we're doomed to relearn it the hard way. In the trials after the war, the Germans were charged for state crimes against democracy. Politicians, press, police, public servants, military personnel were all guilty, and I was just doing what I was told was not an excuse. They say that the tracking and surveillance is for our safety. But the Germans were told this also. Who will watch the watchers? Who guards against the state crimes against democracy? We, the people. They say that they need to read everything that we do on the internet to catch the pedophiles. We say, why do powerful pedophiles walk from the highest courts in the land? Why then has a police report that names 28 high-ranking politicians, judges and lawyers as suspected pedophiles been made secret by the Royal Commission for the next 90 years? Who watches the watchers? Who guards against the state crimes against democracy? We, the people. They say you don't need encryption if you have nothing to hide. We say you don't need to spy on me if I have nothing to hide from. Who watches the watchers? Who guards against state crimes against democracy? We, the people. They say trust us with secret courts, secret cabinets, secret police, black budgets and unlimited surveillance powers. We say, do I look like I was born yesterday? I know I have nothing to hide. What are you up to? First they removed the means of free speech. Your videos are pulled from the internet. All messages are read. Everything you send. All calls on the phone listened to. All speech in public monitored. Then they make speech a crime. No criticism is allowed, no dissent. No one will hold them to account or oppose them. Who watches the watchers? Who guards against state crime against democracy? We, the people. When this is done, will you stand there and say, I was just doing what I was told? Or will you stand and say, I did what I knew was right? Now, we don't face the erosion of our liberty of free speech, of freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, of freedom of association, and of freedom of thought. No, today we face the removal of those liberties, and with them our ability to guard against state crimes against democracy. We, the people, must have freedom to think and to speak according to our conscience.
Yes.
We watch the watchers.
Yes.
We guard against state crimes against democracy.
Yes.
It is your duty as a citizen of a democracy to use the signal to encrypt your calls and use disappearing messages. It is your duty as a citizen of a democracy to use end-to-end encryption on mobile. It is your duty as a citizen of a democracy to use Proton email service and the Proton VPN. It is your duty as a citizen of a democracy to use Tor browser. You have nothing to hide. And if the state can be trusted, then you have nothing to hide from either. It is your civic duty to watch the watchers. It is your civic duty to guard against the state crimes against democracy. It is your duty to demand, to use and to defend encryption that cannot be perverted by state crimes against democracy. And it is the duty of the state to protect that. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. We say it's like a world that led to some of the biggest state crimes against democracy of the 20th century. It's us to make sure that they are not repeated. Use encryption now. In closing, I want to be clear. This is not to compare our government to the 20th century government of Germany. It is a statement of a key lesson of that century. In a democracy, it is your duty to detect, to resist a slide into state crimes against democracy. We do this by securing our democracy from within. Use encryption now. Let me say that again. Use encryption now. If you only take one thing away from today, use encryption now. Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us. Paul Seals here. We're covering off on a pretty sensitive topic tonight, and it's sort of long overdue for this conversation. I've got the author of Citizen One book, Paul Conlon, joining us. Hi, Paul. How are you going?
G'day, Paul. I'm going really well. How are you, mate?
Great. Thank you for joining us. So this is either a highly charged topic or something that most people don't want to know about. So you're sort of caught right between the spectrum as far as that's concerned. But let me ask you first, and we'll dig into the conversation around digital IDs and digital identities. But I'd love to know first a little bit about your backstory and what the impetus was for you to write this book, Citizen One, about digital identity, etc.
Yeah, I'd love to, sure. So I'm a degree qualified engineer. I've spent a couple of decades working professionally with digital systems, mostly in Australia and around the world. And I'm a product manager as well. So I've had commercial experience with, I suppose, bringing products to market in desirable ways that make consumers actually want to consume them. So I kind of know technology from the backstage and front of stage perspectives.
Yes.
And so my career has been very much one of the human digital or human technology experience. And prior to the last few years, I was just like everyone else, kind of enjoying their career and enjoying their life. And then the world changed. And like many of us, I suppose, I saw it as a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. There were so many things going wrong with the world that it was kind of a feeling of where do you start, you know?
Yes.
And I found many of the domains of battle, I suppose you could say, were fairly well represented. And the obvious one is the medical field. There were many brave doctors standing up and putting their professional careers on the line to speak the truth. And because I had a kind of keen eye for this, I suppose, I noticed there was one very underrepresented area, and that was digital ID.
Yes.
And I get why. It's a very nuanced topic. And the only thing I kind of saw in public discourse was, we don't want a Chinese credit system,
Social credit system,
social
yeah.
credit system in place here. And that's completely valid. But I think the lived experience in China is sufficiently removed from our day-to-day lives that it didn't really hit home and resonate with people.
Yes.
And so I thought, well, I'll do something about this. And the other dimension to, I suppose, my history is the particulars of my family story. So I've got a bit of an interesting family background. My grandmother was a teenager and lived in Germany during when the Second World War started. She lived in a town called Ratibor, which was then right on the Polish border. And she heard with her own ears the tanks roll into Poland on September 1st, 1939. And so my grandfather, her future husband, was in the Royal Signals and was one of the last to leave Dunkirk. So my grandparents came from opposite sides of that war, but they had a kind of unifying experience about some of the lessons or some of their take on how it reached the ferocity that it did. And as a boy, I now learn that I now know that I was being educated in some of these nuanced topics about the value of our identity and what can happen when it's leaked into the world without even knowing it. So I felt like I had the technical background and the human story behind it as well, to write something other than a textbook on digital ID. So
yeah,
spent a few years researching that in the online Bundesarchives. It's a very dark chapter of my life, but it's culminated in a book that's available now. So
yeah. Well, great. Thank you for writing that book anyway. And it's interesting. So that preface there with my speech that was at the Brisbane front of the Brisbane City Hall in May 2020. So that was pretty preemptive about what was happening at that point in time. And now here we are, sort of in the fifth year later, and we're also across like the forefront of what's happening with the digital agenda. And just to be clear as well, I mean, I'm not a technophobe by any stretch of the imagination. I think there is a lot of there is a lot of ignorance in this area around digital identity or what it actually means. And I've been talking about this stuff for a long time, so it's great to meet authors and people that have taken the time to do the research and invest in it as well. So my concerns are around, like you said, the integration of the social credit system integrates with the digital identity, and they need a digital identity then to create the foundation for things like central bank digital currencies and that sort of thing. But to a certain degree, the majority of people still seem to dismiss it as being fanciful or conspiracy theory or et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, what are you bumping up into in relation to trying to get your message out in this conversation with educating people?
So that's a great question. And it's one, the answer to that has actually surprised me. So when I embarked on this journey, I was bracing myself for the kind of resistance that you would potentially expect. But I've found quite the opposite. I have found across the board support for this. And that was part of my educational journey on this topic that I'm hoping to share with the broader public.
Yes.
I think you're right. There's an ignorance to it, and I think that's because there are multiple pillars that comprise the teeth behind this topic. And so the ignorance is not the kind of I don't want to know, dig my head in the sand type of ignorance for the most part. I think it's just a genuinely complex area that people don't have the resources to kind of dig into in a simple way, and that's why I went through multiple revisions. I rewrote the book at one point because it just wasn't basic enough. And so I think there's a particularly in this country, there's a culture of resistance to this general feeling of being surveilled and the need to over-identify all the time. And we see this in the nuance, right? It's not uncommon to hear people complain about the cameras at the self-checkouts and the general kind of the QR codes at restaurants, and you hear that in the general discourse, and I think that strikes at a deeper vein. And so I think this country in particular has one of the best chances of getting a positive outcome out of this. And that's one key message I want to drive home, is that this is not something we have to cower in the corner about and be defeatist about. In my book, I trace back even as far as the Eureka Stockade, that kind of visceral rejection of the state wanting to know more about you than you know about the state. And the obviously recent history example of that was the Australia card in the mid-'80s that went to a double dissolution election. I do a case study of that in the book. So this country has very good bones. I think people are eager to learn. And I've broken the topic down into four major pillars that are easier for people to digest and understand the value of our identity and the consequences of leaking it into the world, whether that's towards the state or the public in general.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing as well, Paul, is the fact that Australia definitely seems to be the tip of the spear and the testing ground as far as the technology is concerned. And I think it's a multi-leveled and multi-layered approach or concern that's involved, given the fact that if you can, for those of us who can see the big picture and see the interconnectedness of all things, and you mentioned things like the social credit system, etc., and then you have the digital identities, and then you have the central bank digital currencies, which even any of these things in and of themselves are very dystopian. We talk about central bank digital currencies have the ability to be able to be tracked, traceable, confiscatable, taxable in real time, able to be programmed in geographical locations, geo-fenced in. So as we experienced during COVID, so even one of those areas in and of itself, but they all seem to be weaving together at the moment. And the interesting, and then you've got the overlay of just the AI, the artificial intelligence or the autonomous intelligence, the overlay of that all together. And Stephen Hawking, whether he's credible or not, made the comment back in 2013 that his fear for humanity being dominated by artificial intelligence, and there was the whistleblower that was sort of suicided a while ago for the OpenGPT system and that sort of thing as well. I joke, I have to try and make jokes on social media because I even heavily shadow banned, and that was that humans don't need digital IDs. We need digital IDs for AI. So we need to know what's AI and what's human. That's the thing. Any thoughts around that?
Absolutely. In fact, a few thoughts, but just on that last one first. There are private companies at the moment building what's called SSI, or self-sovereign identity systems, which are completely the opposite digital ID systems to the centralized government monoliths that we're talking about here. They're privacy-preserving technologies, and part of that suite of private products is exactly what you described: a mechanism for making obvious the sovereignty of certain data from AI systems, and going even further and proving the data set that the AI system was trained on. So you have some sovereignty of kind of the input into these systems as well as the output. So that kind of stuff is being built in the free market right now. And I make the case, why aren't we adopting these privacy preserving technologies to push us into the digital future rather than these dangerous government alternatives?
Yes, well, it's that. And then, I've been talking about it for a number of years, probably for about the last 8 years, talking about splitting into parallel economies and then the difference of models between centralized, top-down power structures to decentralized and that sort of thing as well. But it's, it's interesting that people sort of there's so many levels and layers to the conversation that people don't seem to be able to, and you've got to sort of unpack each compartment at the time to get into the interrelatability of it all. Yeah, it's very interesting. But for those that are uninitiated, can you just create in language what a digital? I mean, obviously, there's people saying, well, it's much more convenient, and I don't have to carry around a passport and a driver's license, and it'll be on my phone, and if you've got nothing to hide, Paul, what are you concerned about?
Oh, well, let's address that one first. So that nothing to hide, nothing to fear was addressed by Paul Chadwick. So in 2006, he was the Victorian Privacy Commissioner, and he made the following quote: "Nothing to hide, nothing to fear, directed at each member of the public, should be turned around and directed at the government as no legitimate reason to know, no legitimate reason to ask." So the burden of proof needs to be on those who want our access to our very, very valuable identity. So digital identity in a nutshell, particularly the centralized government versions that we're talking about now, is for many reasons a very dangerous thing. And it relates to the nature, the unique nature of personally identifying data. So I walk through this in a very first principles way, and a very philosophical way in the chapter on identity in my book. It turns out that identity is the way we express ourselves in the world. It's all that we are. It's all that we will be. It's the way we interact with people. It's the foundation of trust and relationships. It's everything, but it has this quirky characteristic. Identity is highly correlated with resource access. And you can see this everywhere. You know, when you go to access your bank account, you're asked for, you know, your name, maybe your address, your phone number, your mother's maiden name, all of these Phil Windley, who's an author, he wrote the book, Learning Digital Identity. He calls these traits a bundle of sticks. They're just a bundle of little characteristics about you that some entity will decide is enough to adequately identify you for, you know, the exchange of goods, services, or information. So in society, we use identity to generally deny access to resources unless you prove to someone else's satisfaction that you have the right bundle of sticks, you know. And so that's a very dangerous thing, because our resources are everything. And we've seen in the past that part of our resources is our lived experience. So it's our labor. It's the ability to earn an income from labor. So our identity characteristics can be used also to exploit us, to blackmail us. You know, the more you know about someone, the more you can influence their life. That's quite a tangible correlation. And again, you don't have to look very hard to see evidence of this. You know, poker players, for example, there's a whole science about hiding your tell, you know, these little characteristic twitches or whatever the opponent can use to actually earn prize money. So resource access and identification are highly linked, and the denial of access to resources is consequently highly linked. But the thing is, we're playing with fire when we don't need to be. So the reason why we're told generally we need to identify all the time is to form some degree of trust, as I mentioned before, you know, the ability to exchange goods, services, or data. And there are other ways to form trust. And this is maybe one key message we could take away from tonight, is to get people to think about the nuance behind trust. And I devote another chapter to trust, because it's important to lay out the conflation that's happening here.
Yes.
So when a government
Stephen
says, we need to give you a green tick to say that you're trustworthy, you're actually conflating two very different things. What they're doing to you is they're conjuring up images of your mind of the type of trust you've built with your neighbor. Now, that type of relational trust, or with family members, is built on common shared history and skin in the game. There's a bunch of interactions that happen over time where people, you know, offer some vulnerability and see if it's reciprocated, and that's relational trust. But we have that, confusingly, we use the one word for institutional level trust as well. So, you know, your relationship with your insurance company, there is a degree of trust there, but it's completely different to the neighborly trust. And one of the important outcomes of the difference in scale in trust there is trust requires accountability. So between you and your neighbor, you equally can hold each other accountable, because you more or less have the same amount of power. But if you're an individual and you're engaged in a trust relationship with an insurance company or a government, they can very much hold you accountable, usually through the legal system, but how do you hold them accountable? There's an asymmetry of power there. So trust, we're told, is the reason why we need to identify all the time, but we don't. What we're actually after is some degree of reputation. Reputation is a far better metric than identification that we use as a proxy to get to trust. And I go through in the book, you know, some technical solutions for how we can actually use reputation systems online and safeguard some of these keys to our resources and lived experience and still have the same digital experience.
Yes, yes. So, and so how long did it take you to write the book?
I'd say about 3 years all up. So
Okay.
a lot of research. The publication was quite difficult, and the
Yeah.
rewrites as well.
So when you, because I haven't been able to finish your book yet, but we're able to foresee what's happened in the last 12 months in Australia with the whole thing about the Australian government coming down, and in my opinion, as a Trojan horse for the scenario for social media for children to be verified, to be able to access social media, except the requirement and the conditions are that everyone needs to verify, which is ultimately an interface and a stepping stone, like I said, like a Trojan horse into the digital ID agenda. Were you able to foresee that happening? And do you think people are aware of the implications of that?
Yeah, so a few questions there. So yes, I where there's smoke, there's fire, right? And it's hard to come into this topic without kind of preconceived notions from both sides. So you and I would kind of look at what transpired in the last 12 months and say, well, that's obvious. And people of the opposite side type of opinion would justify their own predetermined kind of conclusion.
Well, their ability to sacrifice their privacy for convenience or for what they perceive to be the face of the peace of mind, but technically, some people have said to me, well, the government's becoming a nanny state. Like they're not even allowing me to be a parent to have any oversight with my own children.
Yeah. So my take on this is that front door on your house is the last line of defense between the atomic unit in any functional nation and the state, or basically everything outside it. And it's the smallest functional community is the family. And we have gender roles and we have responsibilities within the family, and they differ. And I find that the state is increasingly just nudging the foot into the door, so it doesn't quite close anymore. And we're still having a conversation at the door, but it doesn't quite close anymore. And I feel that that's where we're at. And that's both bad news and good news, I feel, because we can still stomp on the toe from here and close that door and say, no, we're going to hold sovereignty over the family unit, because the family unit is what a nation is built upon. And the sequence of legislative events in the last 6 to 12 months, I think objectively supports what I've just said. So we've had the digital ID bill passed on May 16th, if memory serves. And I note the great contrast between the way that was passed and the way the nation responded to the Australia card. Interestingly, we have much greater access to information now, yet it was much more clandestine the way it was passed. And I think that there was purpose behind that, because this country has shown an aversion to being identified, as I mentioned before, and I suspect that was possibly a deliberate tactic. I don't know. That's a suspicion. I don't have proof of that. But
so for some people that don't know yet as well, Paul, because people have sort of been busy in December and that sort of thing. So I think it was, so the legislation, whatever you want to describe it as, in the last 2 weeks of Australian government, I think in December, passed the legislation for the digital identity. Is that a precedent? Has Australia set the precedent for the rest of the world in relation to the digital ID?
So that's a nuanced question. I think there were a few. Part of the confusion of this is there are actually a few bills. There's the identity verification bill. There's actually a few. There's a suite of bills, as Senator Malcolm Roberts calls them, that collectively have present a certain danger. So TEX, which Bill Shorten announced, went live, I think, on December 1st, if memory serves. So this is exactly the centralised digital ID system that I am jumping up and down about.
Yes.
But that quickly led, as you mentioned earlier, into the age verification, again sold under the guise of the protection of children. It's presented in a type of way.
We have to protect the children, Paul. That's all it's all about.
Yeah, and again, I think this is quite an effective strategy, debating strategy, argumentation strategy, where you present you correlate an outcome you're after with a particular effect, and you make the effect so viscerally emotional that anyone who tries to debate the outcome you're after has then got to contend with the notion that you're opposed to this, viscerally emotional topic. So that's where the children come in. I feel like our children are being leveraged in a political way. That's my personal opinion, because as I said before, I firmly believe that that's on the family side of that front door in the house. That's the responsibility of the parents. And by proxy, as you mentioned there before, the one of the consequences of this is some degree of overlap between identification and just general internet usage in this country. I have my doubts about how enforceable this will be, particularly with the political situation in the United States at the moment, and where a lot of these social media companies are residing. We don't know how that. It's a very complex set of spinning plates at the moment, but I think that's what we're talking about here is one end of the spectrum. So we're talking about the very kind of extreme broad case where we're talking about national policies and international relationships with social media companies. But the other end of the spectrum is worth talking about too, and that's the kind of micro steps we can make in our individual lives that I maintain we need to do to collectively nudge the Overton window.
Yes.
And I think an important component to this, possibly even more important than the government side of things, is private business. I think, and that's an area where we can actively push back by making it uncomfortable for those who wish to identify us. And it doesn't have to be, they don't have to be big, grandiose displays of protest. We just need to make any identifying questions asked of us, any environments where we're being filmed by companies, we need to make that as uncomfortable as asking a lady whether they're pregnant. There are certain things that are just taboo.
Did you just assume my agenda there?
There are certain things that are taboo, and the person asking them is the one who kind of has to defend why it's been added to the conversation. We need to start acting in a way that becomes the norm for identification. And I can go into why I think there's grounds for that too.
Well, I'll do a share screen in a minute, but I think the pressing thought at the front of mind at the moment is, who are they?
Well, the answer to that is we don't know, and even if we did know, that would rapidly become out of date. So one of this comes down to another pillar I write about and devote a chapter to, and that's on technology. So I try to run people through a crash course in the difference between analog and digital technologies, and I make it quite relatable to everyday life and the properties of digital data and digital systems that people are unaware of, because digital systems separate us in space and time from everything we kind of understand. We can't perceive it with our senses, so we don't really know what it's capable of. So that goes to your question of who are they? Once data is digitized, it's high fidelity, and it transcends space at the speed of light, and it's literally timeless. So we don't know who they are. It may be that in 2 generations' time, this ripe data set that suffered absolutely no loss is available to some well-meaning AI that decides people who wear black shirts are somehow, we need to get rid of them or something.
Domestic terrorists.
It's an unanswerable question. And because that's an unanswerable question, we cannot allow the construction of systems that put such power of centralized identity, the key to our lived experience, in one location for goodness knows who or goodness knows what to make decisions and determinations on in the future.
Yes. Well, I wanted to say as well, you mentioned Malcolm Roberts there before, and thank God for the handful of people that we have in Australia, including Malcolm Roberts and Alex Antic and Babbitt and Jared Rennick and people like that as well. It was interesting. I attended some of the rallies that Malcolm Roberts organised in Australia in 2024. And given what we've faced in the last 4 years and all the movements and that sort of thing, to me, it was probably the most pressing issue that we sort of face in our lifetime, given the potentiality for the dystopian aspect and the agenda of mass surveillance. Effectively, in my words, sleepwalking the masses into digital prisons moving forward. Why do you think it was sort of like like a couple of hundred people at a rally, given I've seen at other events and, from hundreds of thousands of people, why do you think it was sort of low key? Why did it slip under the radar?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of Sun Tzu's Art of War about this. There's a degree of battle fatigue across our society at the moment over the last few years, which I totally understand. And I think there's also a component of that lack of connecting a gut feeling. Like I know this will be a bad thing, but I kind of don't know why. And so I
Yes.
think that can result in a lack of enthusiasm as well. So there are a few things going on there, but you there's also a positive side to that, I think, because yeah, you in my opinion, quite accurately describe, I describe it in my words as the biggest technical and social threat that we face at the moment. It's not AI, it's digital ID because of the
Yes.
nature of linking our lived experience to the digital.
Well, certainly it is in my lifetime, and I'm a big picture. I'm a big picture person, and I can see the connectivity of things. So people just say, "Well, it's digital ID. We already have ID. We've already got a mobile phone number. We've already got a passport. We've already got a driver's license. So it goes digital." And the interconnectedness of it is
Yeah.
actually the saying and the cliche that data is the new oil.
Yeah.
And
So that,
also with what's happened previously with breaches of data,
yeah.
as far as governments are concerned. You,
Yeah.
you wanted to jump in and say something there.
Yeah. So that's one of the classic go-to rebuttals, isn't it? And it's not an argument. It's not a rebuttal. That, oh, well, they've got all that on us anyway.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's kind of, well, you may as well put out the deck chair of the Titanic type thinking. And it's demonstrably inaccurate. So I read the entire, as part of my case study in the book on the Australia card, I read the entire Joint Select Committee report, the original typewritten
Yes.
report that's still available online. And in that, the committee correctly identified that just the linking together of existing data itself is a significant threat. So I understand that people assess threats based on the amount of data that's held. And that's where
Yes.
you get this typical conclusion of, well, they've got that already. So what does it matter if it changes form or gets linked together? But that's
Hmm.
not accurate. And that's one of the I misunderstandings that I walk through in the book. The linking of data in particular adds significant threat. So
Yes.
it's a feature. Distributed systems have one particular feature, and that is that which identifies you within that system is tightly scoped. Once you go out of that scope, it can't touch you. It can't affect your lived experience, as I've talked about before. And like a simple example is your tax file number. It's issued by the tax office,
Hmm.
and you use that number to identify yourself when dealing with that particular department on tax-related issues. But
Yes. So it's compartmentalized.
it's compartmentalized, and if you have some issue with the Department of Transport, which is a state, a state body, that they're completely unrelated. Imagine a world where, and there's no way to second guess the spider web of connectivity that can result when you break those silos down. But
Mm.
if you miss your registration payment, you suddenly get the taxation office coming down on you. Like the connectivity there it means you're constantly living as people in 1930s Germany did, and that is looking over your shoulder, because there's a fear that's born when you don't know what data is held on you, because you
Yes.
don't know what on this particular day will qualify you as the bad guy. So
Hmm. Well, I guess to add to that as well, in relation to the concerns, what we've seen, particularly in the last sort of 2 years, with what happened with the US and the Canadian truckers convoy. So for a lot of people that don't know what sort of went on there, so the truckers were blockading against the mandates. They weren't happy about it. They blocked the streets. And then the intelligence agencies scanned the data for all the people that were in that geographical location, and then proceeded to freeze their bank accounts and their crypto accounts, etc., as well. And I think that was a very early playing of the card in relation to the potentiality of the control that can be excised. There's stuff happening in Victoria at the moment where they're just taking money straight out of people's bank accounts for traffic infringements, etc. So I think, I know that humans are inherently beautiful and great, but there's other people that are nefarious that don't have the best intentions for humanity. And if you're handing your data over in that regard, you have no control of it. And like you said, once that data is captured, and I mean, and I'll share this share screen in a minute as well, but what effectively that means, and then Edward Snowden talked about it a lot back in the movie Citizen 4 as well. He said, if I have your metadata, I can pretty much tell everything about you. So, and this interfaces with what's happening with the smart vehicles and smart cars. So they know exactly where you're driving, where you're stopping, where you're refueling, how fast you're driving, when you're braking. All that data is all captured. So I think, yeah, just the concern in relation to the potentiality for the overreach for all that data. And I mean, every text message you make, every phone call, every internet site you browse, your geographical location with your with your devices, all that data is harvested.
Mm.
And I think that's the concern. And I don't give consent or permission for anyone else to have access to any of that data unless it's specifically been given for that particular specific interaction and transaction.
So we live in an age now where there are systems that know us better than we do. And that's never been possible before. There are systems that I've heard that smart cars now, as you just described, will understand our voting patterns before we've decided, based on all manner of things, your facial expressions when you react to certain news broadcasts on the radio, for example. Did you react to that particular politician's speech with disgust? It's incredible. Now, living in an age where systems know more about us than we do has an important consequence, I think. There's a reason why Gnothe Saeton adorns the Temple of Apollo in Greece, or better known as Know Thyself. Knowledge of ourselves is one of the fundamental pillars of Western civilization. And we just don't have that kind of tangible connection to that. But it's been philosophically identified as one of our core, I guess, pillars. And we live in an age now where we've lost custody of that. We don't know ourselves as well as these systems. So how can we possibly understand the future consequences? And just onto your second point there about the interpretation of data with the truckers and all manner of things. This is another area I attempt to demystify for people, to try and get them aware of the data they share and the possible consequences, and how you can mitigate some of these problems too. So here's another conflation I notice people suffer from. The difference between data and the interpretation of data.
Yes.
They're very different things, and they come with very different risk profiles, and for better or worse. So an example is a courtroom trial evidence. So in a trial, the evidence is akin to raw data. Let's use it as an example as the data that comes off your smartphone. It's just data, and it's the job of the jury to analyze that data and come to some sort of determination about guilt or innocence. That's data analysis. Now, in the case of trial of courtroom data, it can be advantageous to keep that raw data, that raw evidence, because it can lead to exonerating people when future technologies may overturn an inappropriate guilty verdict, like the invention of DNA, for example. That there can be reasons to reevaluate raw data in the future when the political landscape is different, when technology is evolved. It can be advantageous. But the flip side to that is exactly what we're discussing here. And I run through another example in the book, and I take the simple case of the lockdown period where, in certain jurisdictions, people were allowed up to 5 kilometers from their house, say. Now,
yes,
the location data from your phone is the raw data that says, I am 4.5 kilometers from my house. So at the time, that evaluated to you're being compliant. You got a little green tick with the government. Now, if all that was saved was that analysis of the data, the green tick, then no matter who comes along in the future to try and pin something on you They can't. All they can see is that at the time you were evaluated to be compliant, and we've lost to history the mechanism by which you were deemed compliant. But if we keep the raw digital data, all it takes is a retroactive policy change, and there's plenty of evidence of that's happening. It happens in this country. I use some examples in the book. If we just say, at the stroke of the pen, say, well, now 4 kilometers is the retroactive boundary from your house, then all the people who were green ticked are suddenly re-evaluated to be uncompliant. So that's the danger of keeping high definition, timeless data, digital data available for future re-evaluation. And I make the case that we should be very careful about that distinction between data and data analysis. The latter is much less dangerous than the former.
Yes. I just want to share this with you really quickly as well. And then we've got time within the hour, and I want to talk about because you've got an event coming up in north of Brisbane this Saturday evening as well for a dinner. But I wanted to cover this off on this because I've been talking about this for a number of years now. If you can see that on my screen, okay, there, Paul.
Yep.
So I'm very apt with being able to put together pieces of data and be able to map it out, what the agenda and what the intention is on the timelines, etc. So this is a public press release that came out on the 28th of November 2022. This is from the US Department of Defense website, which is Department of Defense releases path to cybersecurity through zero trust architecture. And I was really intrigued when I found this. You have to go really digging for it. You can't actually find it. So it's on the US Department of Defense. This is US defense.gov news. So the US Department of Defense, in its zero trust strategy, which spells out how it plans to move beyond traditional network security methods to achieve reduced network attack surfaces, enable risk management and effective data sharing in partnership environments, and contain the remediate adversary activities over the next 5 years. So that's very interesting. And then for a lot of people, myself, that are on the cusp of tech, I mean, if I never had to look at a screen again, I wouldn't be phased in the least, Paul. But I can sort of see, reading between the lines here, what's on the line. So what they're effectively saying, this is by 2020, I think it's September 2027. So what they're going into details here, in effect, is what they were saying was basically anyone that doesn't have digital ID by 2027 does not get access to the internet. Yeah.
Well, we're potentially facing that here as well. I haven't
under the guise of the social media stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So that might be related to their Real ID Act, I believe, which is an incremental approach to start restricting access to things like domestic flights and access to federal government buildings in the US, unless you've got a digital ID. So that might be related. I can't really speak to that article, not having read it, but one thing that jumped out at me was the terminology, that zero trust architecture.
Yes.
Straight away, it jumped out as another conflation, because what I hear when I hear zero trust is things like trustless blockchain systems, which are entirely different and are actually more trustworthy. There's another section in chapter 4 on technology. I'd explain trustless systems and how they're more trustworthy than the so-called trusted ones. And there's also an engineering suite of tools, I suppose, that are broadly called zero knowledge proofs. They're mathematical proofs, zero knowledge proofs, which it's a remarkable technology that's part of the SSI suite, the self-sovereign identity suite that I talked about before, which allows you to do very cool things like verify you're over 18 without sharing your birth date. And there are, it's beyond the scope of this conversation, but we have the mathematics to do this sort of stuff, and it's called zero knowledge proofs, and it seems to be very conflated with the title of that website there. So possibly that's by design.
Well, that's the thing as well, because there's the ability to create decentralized systems of decentralized IDs, so no one owns and controls the data. Those solutions are in place and wanting to support people that are doing that sort of thing moving forward. But there's also in relation to identifying and verifying who you are, I know sort of people going to clubs and that sort of thing, they have to use their driver's license, but they don't want to have to disclose their address details, etc., which is fully viewable and traceable. So there's a few parts about that.
This is the leakage. This is the unavoidable leakage of information that can be used to can be weaponized against you whenever you go down that impossible path of using identity as a proxy for trust.
Yes.
And this is why we've got if people are interested in this, there's a interview I did with a company in the UK called Checked. It's on my website under the blog section there. We run through a lot of these technologies in a very kind of simplified way to contrast the kind of distributed systems that the private sector is building right now to the very expensive and dangerous centralized ones at the moment. And the main distinction there is us. You know, we own our identities. How can it be any? Our identities are just, you know, the shadow that's cast by us. So we birth the identifying information in an app, you know, under SSI, and we can control how it's shared and how it's scoped, and we can revoke that information as well. It completely flips everything we've known about the internet and identifying on the internet since the late 90s.
Well, the thing is also, if you look at the quotes by people like George Orwell said, you know, if you wanted to imagine the future of humanity, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever. That's really the quite dystopian version. If you think that everything that you do is fully monitored, and then that integrates with the money systems that they need to create the digital ID for to sit the central bank digital currencies, etc. on. Other people are going, well, that's it. I'm not going to use the internet. I'm not going to be using the internet. What are you seeing into the future? What's your?
I see that as very impractical. So the internet is so embedded into our lives now. I just don't see the run off into the bush, you know, scenario as being something that's achievable, let alone desirable. And like this is
it looks pretty attractive to me sometimes, that ball.
Yeah, if you want it to be on your terms though,
that's right. Yeah.
When you want to go and have a hot shower,
that's it.
You want to be able to have a hot shower, and why shouldn't we?
Only if I've got enough social credit points though, I get to have a shower.
Exactly right, yeah. But so my take on this, so we are living in an amazing time that history books will be written about, because I think at the moment, whether we see it or not, we're in this exciting window where we have an opportunity to decide that we will again take custody of that which is ours, or just let it go. And to me, that's an easy decision. It's no decision. You know, we inherited the freedoms through the blood of those who fought before us, fought tyranny before us. And tyranny always pops up with a different type of face, but it kind of says similar things. And so who are we to give that away? You know, at the very least, we should pay that forward and possibly improve upon it for the next generation. Like you don't even need to be alarmist when discussing contentious topics like this. They don't need to be contentious. All we need to do is apply simple engineering principles, and particularly the ones related to risk mitigation. So the classical risk matrix is how likely is something to happen, and how bad is it if it does happen. So you can kind of quantify your approach to any problem like this by saying, well, it's quite likely to happen, but it's a mild inconvenience if it does. So I might not bother too much. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've got, it's very unlikely to happen, but by goodness, it's cataclysmic if it does. And so we'll pay a lot of attention to it. And this is where you come up with, and I'll introduce this into the conversation too, the engineering term of safety critical. We have these concepts of safety critical systems, which is a domain that technology operates in, where engineering products and processes are subjected to rigorous, I suppose, frameworks to ensure the sanctity of human life. And the classic go-to one is aviation, and everyone's aware of that. The processes and the hardware and the software all have redundant systems because things invariably go wrong. And we understand as a society that we don't start blurring the lines with these safety critical systems and start bringing in soft subjective arguments for want of a better term, like convenience when it
Yes.
comes to the binary nature of safety critical systems. And part of my thesis in the book is we should be considering digital identity as a safety critical system, and we should be applying all of the stringent, very inconvenient checks and balances that we do to aviation to digital ID. That should necessarily be inconvenient when we're dealing with using technology to identify human beings, because in that risk spectrum, it
Yes.
very much falls in the quite unlikely, maybe at least for now, but cataclysmic if it does happen.
Mhm. Okay, I just want to share this because we only got about 5 minutes left as well. I want to share this article with you here as well, if you can see it there. So this is from October 2023. Microsoft to help Australia build Cyber Shield. Anthony Albanese announces in Washington. So yeah, if you can go to, that's on abc.net.au as well. But I mean, Cyber Shield sounds a little bit like Orwellian doublespeak to me. And I think my concern around sort of reading this, given there's like $5 billion, I don't know whether that's probably Australian, but yeah, my concern in relation to that is it creates the possibility, because people are talking about Cyber Shield sounds doublespeak. Yep, that's, there's stuff that circulates through the consciousness with the media and that sort of thing, talking about cyber attacks. My mum didn't even know what a cyber attack was before the media started even talking about it. But so cyber attack sounds great, that people can't get in. But my concern in relation to that has the ability to integrate with with the digital ID and CBD scenario to create a geodome or a geofence or a geoblock or any of those terms that you want to be able to use, so that they can actually fence that. So because people go, well, if they've got a CBDC, how can they control that it's only spent within that geographical area? And that technology that they're referring to there, in my opinion and in my intuition, creates the mechanism to be able to enforce that.
And it goes back to what we were talking about before, where these systems know more about us than we do. So it's not implausible. In fact, it's quite possible that they will know where we are better than we do.
Yes.
That already happens now with Google Maps.
It's
right?
refreshing for when we get old and Alzheimer's.
I'd rather be lost, to be honest. But again, like I don't know the details of Cyber Shield here.
Yes.
And I feel like, again, there's a tempting trap here. And the trap is to start going into the details. What's this particular program? How could this be misused? I think we need to become more comfortable with more first principles analysis with these sorts of things. The only secure computer is one that's switched off. So that's just a fundamental IT premise.
Yes.
So with that granted, we see that the more data that is centralized in any one particular system, the more vulnerable it is. There's one attack vector. There's one potential. One breach can release more data. So the more decentralized you make it, one breach provides increasingly less access to data.
Okay.
So
I was just going to interject on that point there really quickly, Paul, as well, as that technically would be correct in relation to a device that's off, but that's not necessarily the case now that the devices still have surveillance capability. And then what happens as the technology goes from 5G, 6G, 7G, 8G, etc., then it interfaces with the Internet of Things.
I was just going to raise IoT. Yeah.
Okay. So the Internet of Things and then the Internet of Bodies, which is actually another whole conversation within itself as well. So technically, those devices are remotely charged. So they're always on, always talking to each other.
It's amalgamating multiple sources of input, from cameras that we don't control to all sorts of the sensors in our cars, as you mentioned earlier. And we don't even know what's monitoring us, let alone know how that could be analyzed. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it was Charlie Munger, I might be wrong, who said something like, show me the incentives and I'll tell you the behavior, something like that. And when I see large funding efforts and government programs like the one you just pulled up on the screen there, and it just makes you wonder what's the motivation behind that? And the reason why I ask that is when I go out in public, I don't hear people talking about how the biggest problem in their life is the lack of digital ID. I hear a lot about cost of living. Redfield and Welton Strategies did a a survey in 2023 that I quote in my book, and they surveyed some of the top. They ordered the topics that were most relevant to Western voters, and at the top of the list were things like cost of living, we just mentioned, immigration, election integrity, obviously. A few of the big ones that you'd find quite relatable. You know what wasn't on the list at all is digital ID. And they even had a category for don't know. So don't know got more votes than digital ID. So where's the motivation, particularly as we've described, that there are already free market solutions being built by private industry that have all the features that these systems don't, and that are already available at a much lower cost. So there's some other unknown component of motivation here.
Yes.
And where there's smoke, there's fire. And I think that's all you need to know from first principles reasoning without knowing what the particulars are.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so I'm just going to share this here. This is so that's the book, Season 1. How can people find that book, Paul?
Yeah, so it's on my website, paulgconlon.com. So you'll be supporting a local printed business here in the Gold Coast as a family business that does the print. It's in color. It's got a lovely soft matte cover on it. And yeah, if people can get it from my website there, as I said, there's a blog there. And if you sign up to my mailing list, it's all free. Like I try to send out as much information. I send out snippets from the book for free every now and then, and I try to just help people. A lot of my interviews will help people and to kind of understand this space a bit better and understand kind of why and how they should value their identity. And once you understand that, I think a lot of the natural solutions to these problems find their own path.
Yes. So you've got an event coming up this Saturday evening on the north side of Brisbane. You're going to be speaking and talking about your book.
At Sandgate, yeah, it'll be something like this, but the in-person events will be great because we'll have a Q&A, and I'll kind of walk people through a lot of what we've talked through here and a little bit more about the trust and technology side, and possibly a little bit more about the human side. My book is, as I mentioned before, it's not a dry textbook. It's very much a human story that's kind of weaved in with some extensive historical research and some technology and history and all of that. So we'll be talking about that and have a nice meal, and I'll do some book signings there. You can pick up a copy if you come along, but the number on the screen there, you'll have to call that number to book ahead of time because it's a small venue, and we'll need to you have to get in for a seat.
Yeah, that number is 0417 622 961. So I think there's a limited capacity there as well.
That's right.
Paul.
Yeah.
So it's good to get back to in-person events again. But I appreciate your time this evening, Paul. Thank you for your contribution with this book and for your time this evening. I'll just close this stream out anyway, and we've got some private questions and that sort of thing with our community coming through. So
my genuine pleasure. Yeah, thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. Look forward to meeting you on Saturday evening in person.
As do I.
Okay, wonderful.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.